Hey everybody, and welcome back to our walk through Acts series that we're doing. A couple of years ago, and by a couple of years ago, I actually mean about 13 years ago, as my youngest daughter Brooklyn was just a little baby when this happened. We went on a car kind of road trip to Minnesota as a family with my in-laws, and my father-in-law had this really cool contraption for back then, which was a Garmin GPS unit. Now, again, this is obviously back before smartphones all had GPS units that gave you, step-by-step directions, and this was like the newest thing. It was super fun, and so he had this GPS that he called Sophie, and so all throughout this trip, we kept talking about Sophie and how, hey, let's ask Sophie how to get to the Mall of America and how to get, to cross the state and to Minnesota for that matter. And Sophie was great. Like, she was awesome. I mean, turn by turn, step by step, Sophie was nailing it and really getting it done. And one day we're driving through this kind of, rural part of Minnesota, which is most of Minnesota. And all of a sudden we came to a construction site. And at this construction site, they had a big part of the freeway blocked. And so they sent us off this exit on a detour. And again, back in the day, Sophie only knew what Sophie knew from her last download. She wasn't live and connected to the internet. So Sophie was struggling with this detour. As we're driving on the road, she keeps saying, like, in 100 feet, do a U-turn, do a U-turn, do a U-turn, turn left here, turn left. She's just trying her best to get us back to the freeway, which we know we can't do. And it was this epic moment of failure for poor Sophie. We're like, Sophie doesn't know anything. This whole idea that, like, Sophie was almost omniscient on this entire trip. Like, she knows how to get everywhere. Sophie's awesome. Now Sophie is totally wrong. And the rest of the trip, we'd be like, well, should we ask Sophie how to get? We're like, nah, she doesn't really know. She might get us lost. She might make a mistake, right? Because she failed in terms of explaining to us the way to get somewhere when things got changed up on her. And this is just kind of a fun aspect of life, is that, well, we all have our own way of doing things and going places. And maybe you already know this, maybe this is new, but in Acts chapter 9, we get reminded of something that's kind of cool, that the early church was not called the church, and it wasn't called Christians or Christianity. They were actually called followers of the way. And that was what the first group of Jesus people were called. And sometimes they were just called the disciples. They called themselves the disciples or the followers of Jesus. But in Acts 9, we get this reminder that this is who these guys are. They are followers of the way. And Jesus himself called himself, well, he said, I am the way and the truth and the life. Because Jesus knows that all of us have a way of doing things. All of us have a way of life. Right? You have a way in which the way you manage your time, the way that you think about success, the way you think about right and wrong, and how you do success, how you do right and wrong, how you view failure for that matter, right? How you do time management, all kinds of things, how you load the dishwasher. You've got a way that you do it, and you learn that way from somebody. Somebody taught it to you, or your own life experience taught it to you, whatever it might be, but our own belief systems about life give us or point us in the direction of the way in which we're going to live. It's part of how we answer those big questions of life. Where do we come from and what's wrong with it and how do we fix it? And, what are the values by which we live and what happens to us when we die? And those are kind of the way, the direction, the movement, the steps of life. Well, Jesus has those answers and a way to do life, and his followers are going to follow in his way. That's what he gives them. And so in Acts 9, we see where this guy Saul steps into the place now, and he begins to persecute or arrest or imprison or even vote for the execution of followers of the way of Jesus. And now in this whole book of Acts, there's this sort of turning point shift where this guy Saul's going to show up. He's eventually going to be called this guy Paul, and he's going to become a main player in this. But he starts out persecuting, attacking, and completely against the followers of Jesus. And so we get this little introduction to him, that he goes ballistic on the church in Jerusalem. It's why the church is spreading all over the place, which is really good. Now, though, he's realizing these followers of Jesus, they're not just in Jerusalem, like they've gone everywhere, right? He has whacked them in Jerusalem, and they just ended up spreading out like whack-a-mole. They're everywhere now. So he gets letters to go to another city called Damascus to go hunt down some more followers of Jesus, followers of the way. And it tells us that while he's on this trip and this journey to get there, as he gets close to the city, he gets hit by this bright light in the middle of the day, and it blinds him and it knocks him to the ground. And then a voice speaks to him out of this bright light, and it says to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he has the very uncomfortable position to have to ask, who are you, Lord? Like that's a rough scenario. I can't even imagine what just the sheer weight of reality of that moment must have been like to have to speak back to God who's speaking to you to say, who are you? And, I don't even know who I'm persecuting. And he says, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting, right? Because you're persecuting my church and my people, therefore you're persecuting me. So he tells Paul, look, get up on your feet, go into Damascus, and I'm going to have somebody there who's going to meet you. And it's an amazing experience because Saul gets blinded in this moment. And for the next 3 days, he gets led by the hand into Damascus, where he's waiting for this person who God is going to send. And there's a couple things in this I think are just interesting to think about. Here's Jesus confronting Saul, his enemy of the church, who has the power to blind him, to stop him in his tracks, but he also has the power to heal him and to redirect him. And yet he just blinds him and says to go to Damascus. He doesn't tell him anything more than that. In fact, I think it's really interesting that while he could have done a lot more in that moment as God for sure, he then leads and directs Paul back to the very people, the very church that he has been persecuting up to this point. And so it says that he goes to Damascus, and in Damascus there's this man named Ananias. And I love that Jesus shows up in Ananias and says, hey, Ananias, there's this guy named Saul who just got to town. I blinded him on the way here. I want you to go and put your hands on him, pray for him, and heal him. And it's this awesome picture because here's Ananias responding back to God, like reminding God. I've heard about this guy, God, and, he frankly is not a very nice guy. In fact, he's a problem guy. In fact, he's been creating a lot of problems. Like, he's been trying to destroy your church. I don't know if you ever had one of those prayers where you just tell God, hey, God, just FYI, just a little reminder in case you're skipping some of the details here. This isn't a good idea. I mean, that's kind of how Ananias is approaching this. But God says to him, yeah, I know, I get it, Ananias, I understand. This is a confusing one. I can appreciate that. But I want you to go. In fact, I love what he says to him. In Acts 9:16, he tells Ananias, look, you're going to go and you're going to heal him, and I will show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake. And I always find this so fascinating that Jesus takes this guy Ananias, who's part of his church. He's going to go and he's going to heal Saul and restore him and be kind of the messenger that's going to come with God's next step for Saul's life, even though God himself is speaking to Saul. And yet he comes with this voice of saying, I just must show you how much you must suffer for my name's sake. And suffering is obviously a powerful word. It's not one we like. It's one that we're feeling a little bit in a way, a low-grade suffering. Maybe actually this feels like extreme suffering. I shouldn't say that. I don't know what it's all like for you. But it's interesting when this very idea and this very word in church and in theology, the idea of suffering and passion go so often together. If you ever heard of the Passion of the Christ, it's describing the suffering of the Christ. And there's a sense of which he is telling Paul, man, you are going to suffer for my name's sake. But at the same time, this is going to become your passion. It's going to become your purpose. I mean, Saul's whole life has just done a 180-degree turn. Really, in just the moment when he met Jesus, when he found out that the God that he worshiped is actually Jesus, the risen Christ and the risen Messiah, it is going to completely transform and change Paul's ministry. And Ananias comes, prays for him, opens his eyes, he sees, he gets baptized, and almost immediately he begins telling people about who Jesus is and what Jesus has done for him. And that's an incredible thing in and of itself, but it's this great reminder, I think, to us that what Jesus does is go to his very enemies with the purpose of making his enemies his friends. That's what he does for Saul. That's what he does for us. That's still what God is all about. That God is all about taking his enemies and making them his friends. In fact, it's what Jesus said we as his followers living in the way of Jesus are supposed to do. And way back in Matthew chapter 5, where he talks about, loving your enemies. And if you love your enemies, then you're going to be the sons and daughters of your Father in heaven, because this is what God is doing all the time. He is demonstrating his love and his faithfulness to a world that is living radically apart from him, not following after him, not trusting in him, not living in his way. And he's saying to his people, follow in my way, and that's going to mean loving even your enemies and demonstrating that you are sons and daughters of your Father in heaven. And this is all this incredible picture of this transition. And in Saul, we see it so clearly because here's a man who goes from a life of violence, of kind of power, control. Even the word law is a big part of why he's going. He believes in that Jewish law so much. And yet he gets transformed and he becomes the biggest proponent of this incredible little word that we're going to hear about called grace. And what's awesome is this grace comes into his life just as it comes into our life. And it changes us into being the people that live and do the things that Jesus himself did for us, again, to follow after his way. And that purpose he brings, and that love he brings, and that forgiveness he brings, it's all part of that word, God's grace in our life, meaning we can't deserve it, which is also the same answer to why and how we love our enemies, not because they deserve it, but because it's what Jesus has done for us. You guys, that's just the first portion of Acts chapter 9. It's got a lot of other great stuff that's about to happen, but I hope you can take that and you can run with it, and at the very least, let that step into a place of your own prayers. Maybe there's some family, maybe there's some friends that aren't feeling like family or friends so much. There's some tension and isolation. Maybe there's some neighbors. Maybe there's some coworkers. Maybe there's some full-blown enemies. Let those be a place where we begin to pray and ask God, what does it look like to love this person in my life right now? Just like you loved Saul and turned him into Paul. You guys, hope you have a great evening. We'll see you back here on Friday.